Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. For those that haven't met me before, or for those who haven't sat through one of my webinars previously and looking at the attendee list, there's quite a few names that I do recognise. So welcome back if you are joining for the latest webinar coming from myself. So I'm Richard Walsh and I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment. A little bit of history about myself. I've been with NQA now for 15 years. And prior to that, I spent 12 years working for an environmental charity called Groundwork and worked nationally for groundwork from about 1996. So quite a history, quite a background in environment and latterly in energy and also now carbon. So the webinar itself, just a couple of slides. I always joke I'm contractually obliged to show these, just to tell you a little bit about NQA if you're not familiar with us. I'll just leave those slides on the screen whilst I'm talking. So as I say, I've been around with NQA for 15 years, and I'm the Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment, and spend quite a lot of my time working with our larger clients on ISO 14001, ISO 50001, and latterly doing quite a number of carbon verification and carbon neutrality assessments to PAS 2060, which we'll come on to talk about a little bit later on. So those are the slides that I had to show you. And if you haven't met me face to face before, that's me. And just a little bit about my background. Probably should add some new standards to that list on there as well, because obviously now there's a few extra ones. And some others which are quite interesting. There's quite a growth in sustainability standards just at the moment. So keep watching out for new webinars, new information. There's a lot changing, a lot going on, and it all seems to be coming my way at the moment, which is quite interesting. So if you sat through one of my webinars before, you'll know that they go on and on and on, and usually we time them to last about 45 minutes, and we're still here after about an hour and a quarter. I've planned this one to last about 30 minutes. And then as we're going through, if anybody has any questions, on the screen you should have a question box. If you have any questions that you would like me to answer as we're going along, please do so. And I'll try and answer them as they crop up if I feel it's appropriate to do so. If not, we'll sweep them all up and cover them at the end at the question and answer session. To avoid yourselves having to frantically scribble, there will be a recording of this webinar made available. In fact, all our webinars that we deliver through NQA are on our YouTube channel. You will be sent a link to that. All the delegates who are registered, not just those who've turned up, but all the delegates who have registered will be sent a link to a recording of this webinar, and you will also get a PDF copy of the slides as well. So there's no need to write anything unless you particularly feel the need to. You can listen again, go back and listen to it again, or scroll quickly through the boring bits. Not that I hope there are any, but anyway, that's everything. So let's get started. So what are we going to try and do in this next sort of 30 minutes or so? Look at some key definitions and an understanding of the terminology, because one of the things I find that there's quite a bit of confusion sometimes about what the different bits of terminology mean, and some people use one bit of terminology when perhaps they mean something else. Some people think that things are the same, some people think they're different. So right from the start, I want to just try and clear up possibly some misconceptions about what some of the terminology means. We're going to have a look at the journey to net zero and how greenhouse gas inventory and carbon neutrality will help us along the way. And then, as I say, a chance at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So, carbon neutrality, what do we mean? As I say, a lot of people get this confused, I think, with net zero, assume it's the same thing, and it's not quite. They are subtly different. So carbon neutrality means taking steps to remove an equivalent amount of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere as the organisation are emitting. So it's a balance. So you're carbon neutral. You're taking out the atmosphere somehow, somewhere, an equivalent amount of greenhouse gases that you're actually putting in through your business activities. And with carbon neutrality, this is normally done via an offsetting process, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. So that's carbon neutrality. Offsetting, so a carbon offset, that's a reduction or a removal of emissions of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases made to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. So there are many, many schemes around, offsetting schemes. Some are much better than others, and there are certification schemes for offsetting. But basically, offsetting is about funding, if you like, somebody else to remove their carbon emissions, to offset your own carbon emissions. We'll have a look at the politics around offsetting shortly, but offsets are measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e. They might be removing other greenhouse gases, methanes, things like that, but generally offsets are measured and sold in tons of carbon dioxide. Greenhouse gas inventory, a list of emission sources and the associated emissions quantified using standardized methods. So in other words, it's what is your carbon footprint? What is it that you as an organization, as an individual, as a group, whatever you set the boundaries of, it's a list of the emission sources and the associated emissions using a standardized method. And again, we'll go into some of what the methods are later on. And a greenhouse gas inventory is used for managing greenhouse gas risks and to allow you to identify reduction opportunities. As with anything, you need to know where you're starting from. So it's a way of coming up with using a set prescribed method what your carbon footprint actually is. So to me, one of the big confusions that I see when I speak to people and people ask me questions and when I'm out assessing is the difference between being carbon neutral and being at net zero. And the main difference in my mind, and this is the way I tend to try and explain it, the main difference between the two is the time frame and actually how the target is reached. Now, carbon neutrality can have, unfortunately, a bit of a bad press with the, I shall call them evangelical environmentalists, because in the first year, carbon neutrality does not require any initial reduction of an organization's emissions. So carbon neutrality is a short-term state that most companies can achieve almost immediately by measuring their current emissions and using offsetting to compensate for them. And I fully agree with the comments that are made about carbon neutrality for the first year only. Because in order to retain carbon neutrality, in order to retain certification to the main standard, which is around at the moment, which is PAS 2060, that is going to be replaced by an ISO standard, ISO 14068, but at the moment it's PAS 2060. To retain carbon neutrality status using that standard, you then have to, for subsequent years, produce a reduction plan, a carbon management plan that has a set reduction level. And again, we'll look at that shortly. Net zero is a long-term goal. So we talk about people being net zero by 2035, by 2040. I've been doing a lot of work with universities at the moment. A lot of universities are setting targets of being net zero by 2035, by 2040. And it's only achieved when the company has taken action to reduce the majority of its emissions. So you can't be net zero tomorrow. You can be carbon neutral tomorrow, but you can't be net zero. And carbon neutrality, to me, manages the journey towards net zero. And when you achieve net zero status, you can offset, but only for the small remainder of unavoidable emissions. It's almost impossible to get to absolute zero. Any organization, any business will use a small amount of carbon, produce a small amount of carbon. That's unavoidable. And I think in the Northwest, the Tyndale Centre in Manchester define carbon net zero rather as a reduction of 95%. And we'll look at some of those targets again a bit later on. So that's the sort of target we're looking at, a reduction of about 95%. And then the final 5% will be offset. So carbon neutrality is achieving that balance almost straight away by buying offsets, whereby you are balancing out that equation through the use of somebody else's carbon savings. Whereas net zero, you've achieved it or almost achieved zero yourself. That's why it's net zero. And then the small amount at the very end, in many years' time, might be offset. So to me, the two go hand in hand, and the best way to achieve net zero is through carbon neutrality, because you're making that balance every year that you go forward, rather than reducing your carbon emissions, but actually still being, if you like, carbon positive. You're still producing carbon, albeit less of it as we go through the years. So, as I just said, think of carbon neutrality as the first step on the journey, ultimately, to achieve net zero. So, the road to net zero, or as we sometimes call it, the race to net zero. What does that actually mean? Well, to try and look at that, let's start with some basic science. And I apologize if I'm going over old ground for many of you, but we tend to try and assume that nobody knows anything. That way, then nobody goes away disappointed. So hopefully, we'll talk just a little bit about the basic science and the way that carbon moves around the Earth. So this is known as the carbon cycle. And basically, the carbon cycle consists of sources that emit carbon. Those are not just man-made, there are natural sources of carbon as well. Not just carbon, but we're talking greenhouse gases ultimately, but this is the carbon cycle. So there are sources that emit carbon, and then there are carbon sinks. So that a sink is anything that absorbs more carbon than it releases: plants, trees, the ocean, soils, etc. And the system has always naturally balanced itself out. Yes, there are peaks and troughs, and there are things that happen. There are different, the Earth's climate is constantly changing, and there's been changing over millions of years. But generally, the system has always balanced itself out. But latterly, human intervention is starting to throw a spanner into this cycle. So what's happened? Our activity has created this imbalance between the amount of gases being released and the amount of carbon that the sinks can actually absorb. So obviously, the level of carbon in the atmosphere is starting to grow. And it's warming the planet and driving anthropogenic climate change. You'll see a little asterisk there. I'll tell you what that is in a minute if you don't already know. And to stop the warming, we need to get back to this balance between the anthropogenic emission sources and the removals or the carbon sinks. So, anthropogenic, environmental change caused or influenced by people, either directly or indirectly. So that's what's happening at the moment. Climate change, environmental change, caused or influenced by people, activities, industry, commerce, transport, travel, etc., etc. So to get back to the balance between anthropogenic, I would say the word now, anthropogenic emissions and removals, we get back to this state of net zero emissions, where we're actually emitting an amount of carbon that the Earth can cope with. You've probably seen many, many diagrams like this, and I won't dwell on this, but just for information, that is a diagrammatic version of the carbon cycle, which you have probably seen many, many times. And in an ideal world, that cycle would be in full balance. But at the moment, particularly the factory, auto, travel emissions are tipping the cycle away from producing more carbon than the left-hand side can pull back in. So why is net zero important? Well, as people will tell you, as people say, it's on the news almost every day. You hear people talking about it, and there's been various COP26, COP27. They're all saying the same thing. We're at a critical juncture, and we need to restore the Earth's delicately balanced cycles. And we are witnessing an increase in the frequency and severity of climate-related disasters, and starting to see permanent changes to our environment. And one of the worries is we're now getting into feedback loops. So climate change itself is causing a cyclical chain reaction that results in even more climate change. So on the example that's on the screen there, so increased atmospheric CO2 blankets the Earth, warming is amplified, that leads to warmer oceans, warmer climate, the polar ice is starting to melt, less sunlight is reflected, which means that the warming is amplified, and we get into this feedback loop. And if you've ever been at a concert where you suddenly hear the microphone feeding back, it just gets louder and louder and louder till somebody shuts something down. And that's what we really need to do to close the feedback loops. So there we go. Even if we can manage to cut our emissions, we can't stop there. We're not going to get the carbon in the atmosphere in the very, very short term or even the medium term to get back to pre-industrial levels. We need to take emissions out of the air. We've got to remove billions of tons of CO2 equivalent a year to get to this net zero future. We need to support our sinks, and we need to create new ones. And that ultimately is what offsetting is helping to achieve. There are man-made approaches, engineering ways of capturing CO2, storing it permanently underground, extremely, extremely expensive. And again, maybe just a short-term win, but it's still there. We're still producing it. So action isn't happening fast enough, and we do hear it referenced as a race to net zero. We've got people, countries, corporations making public pledges. As I said, some of the universities I've been working with over the last 12 months are making public pledges to work to not just 2050, but to bring that forward, 2030, 2035. Targets are important, and we can get behind a target, and targets can guide policy, but we can't afford to mix up, conflate goals with guarantees. There are too many goals being made and not enough guarantees. We see this every year at COP26, all sorts of promises we made. We then hear everybody at COP27, well, we haven't done this, we haven't done that. People are not achieving what they said they were guaranteed they would do. So a climate action strategy has to be accurate and transparent. So that's all the background. Where do we start? So if we want to strive for a net zero path, we've got to achieve a science-based reduction target using the Science-Based Target Initiative's corporate net zero standard. So we've got to work to this net zero path. Some emissions can't be avoided or reduced, and that's a fact of life. We live in a modern industrial society. We can't just switch everything off. So some emissions cannot be avoided, cannot be reduced. So the journey has to begin with us becoming carbon neutral. offsetting all emissions from the very start and using that offsetting purchasing power to help the creation of sinks in this country and in other parts of the world that will start to tip the balance back into our favour. So, how do greenhouse gas inventory and carbon neutrality fit into this journey that we're all setting out on to get to net zero as a country by 2050, but for many people before that? So I've sort of mapped out a number of steps to working towards net zero. Measure the baseline, set some targets, make a commitment and share that commitment, plan and reduce, report and offset. Now, 5 and 6 can be interchanged. If you follow the PAS 2060 methodology, 6 comes before 5. So you offset, and as part of the reporting, you are reporting the offset. So really, box 5 on there sort of could also be box 7 at the same time. And once we started out on the journey, 4, 5 and 6 are repeated and repeated and repeated until our emissions are reduced by 90% plus. Okay, Chris is asking a question. What's the latest forecast date for the proposed ISO net zero standard? Yes, there is IWA 42. That will ultimately, Chris, become ISO 14068, and that will replace PAS 2060. It won't be this year. I'm expecting it probably somewhere in 18 months' time, maybe summer 2024. But at the moment, yes, the ISO standard is there, IWA 42 2022. Let me just look at the rest of the question before I, will this replace PAS 2016? Do you mean PAS 2060? Not PAS 2016. But yes, it will replace the current PAS standard. Yeah, it is. So that was a typo, Chris. Okay, thank you. So yes, the ISO standard 14068 will, when that is published, replace PAS 2060. We're not anticipating a huge number of changes to the overall methodology or the end result, but yes, it will be a much more widely accepted standard. Okay, let's keep going. We're 25 past 2 here in the UK, and I did say I'd try and keep the webinar to half an hour-ish, plus a bit of question time at the end. How do you buy carbon reduction? Are there common prices for that? We'll look at that in a minute in terms of carbon offsetting, because there are widely varying prices. So we'll have a look at that shortly. But yes, there are prices. So this is the standard that Chris was talking about in the question he asked, PAS 2060. It's a journey to becoming carbon neutral. And for the work that we're doing within NQA at the moment, clients that we're working with who are seeking verification of their carbon neutral status are using the most common standard available, which is this PAS 2060 standard. PAS stands for Publicly Available Specification. And that has 4 steps: measure, reduce, offset, document, and verify. So you'll see that's not too different to the 6 stages that I mapped out ultimately on our road to net zero. So what we're going to have a look at now for the last 10 minutes or so is how these techniques, these tools fit in with the journey to net zero. So number 1 was measure the baseline. If we're setting out on any journey, we've got to know where we're starting from. We've got spoilt by sat navs that tell us where we started from. We switch your sat nav on, you tell it where you want to go, and it knows where we're starting from. There isn't a sat nav for greenhouse gas emissions. You've got to work it out. You've got to actually work out what your starting point is. So a greenhouse gas inventory, as the name suggests, is a list of the greenhouse gas emissions that you have and the quantities. Now, what I'm not going to do in this webinar, because there's other webinars I've done that go into this in much more detail, and there's a lot of information out there. I'm not going to get into detailed discussions about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Hopefully you'll know what those are. If you don't, there are other webinars I've done. I've done a specific webinar on PAS 2060 that goes into much more detail about what the different elements are. We need to work out where we're starting from. Now, there are many different methods, but ultimately they're all based on the greenhouse gas protocol. There are ISO standards. ISO 14064/1 specifies how to do this, specifies the principles and requirements at an organizational level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. And 14063 is all about conducting or managing the validation. So you can do it yourself, but to add value to your inventory, as you would with your maybe company accounts, financial accounts, you would have them audited. You would have them verified by an auditor. And 14064/3 talks about how to conduct or manage the validation process of an organization's greenhouse gas emissions. That's how all of the 14064 standards fit together. That's actually taken from one of the standards themselves, but just so that you have an idea, that's how it all fits in. So a couple of questions. Sarah's asked me, do you believe that standards such as PAS 2060 and 14064 are relevant and achievable for small businesses? Absolutely. The first PAS 2060 carbon neutrality validation that we did, or that I did, was for a company in the Northwest with about 35 staff. And it was very, very achievable. And it wasn't particularly expensive. We're in the small numbers of thousands of pounds a year to do the offsetting, but it wasn't particularly difficult. And of course, the smaller the business, the easier it is to actually work out the carbon emissions. So absolutely, it is achievable, yes. Be careful of people who try and overcomplicate it. It's not massively complicated in a small business. And I'm happy, if you like, Sarah, to talk to you outside of this webinar. Nigel's asked, do all companies have to become net zero? And if so, by when? There is no requirement. There is no formal requirement. It's not legislative. It's not like a piece of law that says you have to do it. However, what we will increasingly find is that customer pressure, peer pressure, client pressure will start to hit the people who refuse to take action. So whilst it's not mandatory, there we go. Is it mandatory to follow PAS 2060 standard? No, it isn't. Is it mandatory to follow it with 14,064 verification? Right, very quickly, Push Peaker. 14,064 is the methodology that we use in order to validate your carbon emissions. It is one of the ways of managing it. You can, if you're in the UK, you can use the UK government carbon reporting guidelines, which are a set of Excel spreadsheets that give you the carbon emissions for a whole range of different activities and fuels, etc., etc. There is no set way of coming up with the carbon footprint for PAS 2060. However, all the different methods follow the greenhouse gas protocol. Hopefully I've answered all the questions that we came through there. So back on the track, back on our train, if you like, heading towards net zero. Having worked out what our carbon footprint is, we then need to decide what's achievable. We need to set targets. We need to set a target for achieving this point of being net zero. Now, at what rate should we look to reduce our carbon emissions? You know, we could say we're going to reduce them by 0.5% a year, which will take us 200 years to get there. That's probably not going to be satisfactory. It's not going to meet people's expectations. The people, the businesses, the organisations taking this seriously are following what are these science-based targets through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And the targets provide companies with a clearly defined path to reduce their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement goals, which was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and trying to pursue an effort to limit ultimately the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, this table is actually taken from a standard that Chris mentioned earlier on, IWA 42, which is, it's not an ISO standard, but it's guidance. So in order to achieve net zero by 2050, these are the sectoral targets that are now being set in order to get that reduction. So if you're in iron and steel at the moment, if you're mapping the reduction, you need to think about what the reduction needs to be to get to a 93% reduction, to have 7% left to get to that net zero by 2050. So 2050 sounds a long way off, it's 27 years, but actually 27 years to remove 93%, we're talking what, 3%, 4% a year, between 3 and 4% a year to get to that level, and that's starting now. So that's the level of reduction targets that we're looking at. Obviously, it varies sector by sector, and if you go onto their website, the SBTI Science Based Targets Initiative's website, there's a lot of guidance, a lot of information about the different sectors that you're in. There isn't a one size fits all. Typically, the businesses that I'm working with are setting targets of sort of between 3 and 5% a year to get down to this net zero point, which might be somewhere between 90 and 95% total reduction by the mid 2030s. That's where people tend to be setting the targets at. Whatever you're going to do, though, it's got to be authentic, it's got to be transparent. We're not looking for greenwash. There are too many people out there making false promises, pretending that they're doing this, but it needs to be an authentic, it needs to be a transparent communication of the strategy. You need to share your commitments with customers. Share what you're going to do. Tell people what it is you're going to achieve. It helps to seek third-party verification of the greenhouse gas inventory and the plans that sit alongside them. You can just have your initial greenhouse gas inventory verified. All that will do is a bit like having your accounts audited. It will say, our carbon footprint is 5,000 tonnes, and here's another organisation, in my case it will be NQA, say, yes, we agree. But that's only setting your starting point. Past 2060 then sets out this reduction plan, and every year we're looking for a reduction in carbon. We're looking for this to be reduced year on year as we journey towards carbon neutrality. By using the accepted pathways and using third-party verification, that will ensure, and there's a spelling mistake there which I'll alter, authenticity and transparency. So knowing what your carbon footprint is, knowing what the target you're going to achieve is the basis for a comprehensive climate action strategy. But we have to plan to reduce these emissions, a carbon reduction plan. So we need to set a timescale, we need to set appropriate targets. We have to be public about the planned means of achieving and maintaining these greenhouse gas reductions. We have to be able to justify the techniques and the measures employed. And importantly, none of this is all about penalising successful, profitable companies that are growing. The standards allow either an absolute measure, so this year it's 5,000 tonnes, next year it's 4,800 tonnes, that's an absolute decrease, or it can be a decrease in intensity. So tonnes of carbon per tonne of product. That is an acceptable way. So if you double your turnover, yes, your carbon absolute is going up, but the intensity would drop. Chris is asking again, in line with SBTI, do we have to set a near-term target of 50% reduction by 2030? I believe so, yes. So it's not a linear reduction. They are looking for it to be front-loaded, simply because for a lot of businesses starting out, there are a number of quick wins. And as you get further into the sort of past 2030, we're into the harder to achieve reductions. But also, I think there is the hope that technology will help us along the way as well, and that there will be increased opportunities through the development of maybe hydrogen technology, through the use of heat pumps, be it ground source or air pump. There will be technologies that will help us. But yes, I think the SBTI do look at some degree of front loading. So, reporting, as with all commitments, as with every commitment that anybody makes, there is a requirement to report on the progress. And if you remember earlier, I said that this clause could come also after clause 6, which is the offsetting bit. So within past 2060, the reporting bit is known as a qualifying explanatory statement. And it's a public disclosure of all the relevant documentation. We're not asking people to give away any secrets, but there has to be public disclosure of proof of the emissions reduction. So what is it this year? What is it next? What was it the year before? Where are we on the journey? There are legislative requirements for companies over a certain size to have to report this information to government. The SECR, standard simplified emissions carbon reporting. If you're above 250 staff, or if you're a large company, you have to include a lot of this information as part of your corporate reporting. There's be proof of emissions reduction, carbon footprint report, a carbon management plan, and the type of validation that you are using. Is it self-declaration? So for instance, Marks & Spencer self-declare. They took the view that it's not just carbon neutrality, it's Marks & Spencer's carbon neutrality. Why wouldn't you believe them? That's Marks & Spencer's view. So they've just declared themselves. You can also, as we would encourage, have a third party validation, completely neutral in terms of us or any other body saying, yes, we agree, we're measuring this every year and you are on track. So the offsetting bit, if you remember right from the start, carbon neutrality was taking steps to remove an equivalent amount of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere as are being emitted. It's maintaining that balance. So what we need to do within the reporting bit is to identify and document the relevant methodology that's used to achieve the offset. The carbon credits that you buy have to be verified by an independent third-party verifier. It's not as simple as people have asked me. I've planted 20 trees out the back of my yard. Can I claim the carbon from that? No. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't plant 20 trees. However, it's not as simple as saying I've planted a load of trees, I'm going to claim the carbon back from that. To do this properly, to have this properly verified, it has to be verified by an independent third-party verifier. The credits are only issued after the emission reduction has taken place. The Woodland Trust, for example, are selling carbon credits, but the credits are being stored, if you like, and they're stored in a bank and they're using them at some point in the future. And I've had one client who's been caught out by this, who bought a load of these credits from the Woodland Trust, but actually they can't count them because to achieve carbon neutrality, the emission reduction has to have taken place, not stored in a bank that are then being used at some point, maybe next year or the year after. Carbon credits have to be retired. So what that means is they have to be stored in a registry to prove that the emissions have taken place, but also to stop them being sold multiple times. In the early days, there was a bit of a free-for-all, and there were people flogging these things all over the place without any control. So it's quite a complex process to make sure that A, they're valid in the first place, and B, that they're not being sold multiple times. And by offsetting the total residual emissions, that will allow carbon neutrality to be declared. And in my humble opinion, using carbon neutrality on the journey to net zero is, for me, the best place that we can be, because you're achieving that balance from day one, but you are still working towards a net zero future where we are down at 5 to 10% being the residual emissions that are left. So what should your next step look like? Within NQA, we have a full suite of additional training and other information available. We have a particular course, just happens to be on the slide here, Understanding and Achieving Carbon Neutrality. So there is a 2-day course that you can do that goes into this in much more detail. If you look at our website, if you go to NQA/sustainability, there's an awful lot of information around there as well. So where we go. So finally, oops, I think I clicked on, there we go, that's fine. So all we're going to do now is I'm just going to try and sweep up any questions that I haven't covered, and also give you a final chance to ask any questions that you haven't asked at the moment. I am happy to be contacted outside of this. I'll give you my email address. It's not on the slide, but I'll give you my email address. It's richard.walsh, W-A-L-S-H, @nqa.com. And I'm quite happy to have one-to-one discussions with any of you or all of you, if you feel that you have any specific questions to ask. So at the moment, there's just a couple of questions that we're going to get into. I think, to be fair, some of them are quite technical, so I'll see how we get on. And I'll read the question out, and I'll see whether we can get into answering it without too much detail. So carbon release is very dependent on the nature of the organisation. Absolutely, fully agree. Electronic manufacture is a different story than an insurance company. Is there a category-based targets and expectations? Well, I hope I've shown that if you go into the SBTi pages, yes, there are targets, and I think I showed the table which gave a number. Obviously, it wasn't an exhaustive table. There are different targets for different industries based upon how easy it is. So things like the office-based organisations are looking for about a 99.5% reduction, whereas the more sort of manufacturing-based might be only 90%. They are all, I believe, certainly above 85%. Reduction targets. Oh, now then, what's this one, Raymond? Right, okay. We're an SME and chose a baseline of 2019, a year when we transitioned from an old 4-floor mill building into a 1970s 2-floor office building. Our baseline emissions, scope 1 and 2 only, reduced by 73%. In 21, we started to try and collate scope 3, including employee commuting. As an office-based company, how can you reduce the employee commuting emissions? Right, so without getting too technical, so employee commuting, people traveling into work, is a scope 3 emission. Working from home, not that I would encourage everybody to work from home all the time, but that has obviously helped in terms of some scope 3 emissions. But if you follow the UK government guidance and the UK government spreadsheets, there are also scope 3 emissions factors for working from home as well. Depends on how many hours a person works from home. It is very difficult to reduce the employee commuting emissions. You can influence how people choose to come to work. You cannot control how people come to work. You cannot mandate that people must come on public transport. You can't mandate that they must drive an electric vehicle, etc., etc. You can influence, you can try and make it easier for them to choose better ways of traveling. You can maybe subsidize better ways of traveling. But at the end of the day, you can only work with your employees to try and help them reduce that. If a successful company with 2,000 employees who are paid very well and go on holiday every year, do they need to take that into consideration? No. So the carbon footprint of their employees is not counted unless it's a carbon footprint of things they're doing directly related to your business. So if they're working from home, if they're traveling into the office, yes, you take that into account. How they live their lives outside of work is not your concern, other than you might like to, and a lot of my clients have programs to try and encourage people, you're doing this at work, why not think about doing it at home? And providing people with additional help and maybe resources to allow them to consider their own personal carbon footprints, but in no way would you be expected to count the private activities of your employees. Oh, right. Scope 3 supply chain. Are there any suggestions on how to manage the action plan engagement with suppliers, any resources that can be consulted? I think that might be better, Caroline, if you were to send me an email and we could just have a chat, or I can send you some information. Because I need to be, what time are we now? We've been going 3/4 of an hour. I need to be in another meeting in about 5 minutes time. So yeah, if you want to just send me an email, Carolina, and we can, I'll reply. So it's richard.walsh@nqa.com. I think the final question, with regards to absolute or intensity-based targets, our company is debating what to use, given we'd like to measure CO2 tonnes, however, also account for company growth. Current examples being discussed are metric tonnes per unit of production or per unit of hours worked. Is there any insight? I guess it depends again on what you're doing. If you are a manufacturing organisation, I would certainly be looking at using either per tonne of product or per cost of sale, £1,000 of sales or something like that. A number of other organisations do use headcount. They use hours worked. Again, it's horses for courses, really. There isn't a set way of looking at the sort of a performance indicator. But certainly manufacturing, I would either be looking at tons of product produced or the value of the product that's used. What's this one? For 100% renewable electric, should we still account for UK National Grid, WT and T&D? I think no for WTT and yes for transmission and distribution. Again, I could do a whole webinar on this, Mike. If you are buying 100% renewable electric, you still have to use the conversion factor for the national grid. Don't want to get into too technical details. It's all to do with what are known as REGOs, which are certificates that are produced by the companies producing green electricity. If you've got a wind farm, every megawatt of electricity you produce from your wind farm produces 1 REGO. The problem is those REGOs can be sold. So when you are buying your electricity from the grid, even though you're on a green tariff, the reduction in the grid CO2 has already taken into account the electricity that you're buying from that wind farm. So unfortunately, it's the most disappointing thing I end up telling people, that everybody goes, oh, we're on a green tariff, so it's zero. No, it's not. You do need to get into that. Now, do you mean dual reporting, Mark? Right, I haven't time at the moment, Mike, to get into the difference between market and location-based reporting. If you want to send me an email, we'll have a chat outside of here, because I've got to be somewhere else in 15 seconds. So I'm going to draw a line under that. There are no more questions. There's still about 100 people left online. So I'll thank you for your attendance. If when you get a link to the recording of this webinar, when you get a copy of the slides, feel free to send me an email. Feel free to get in touch, and we can continue these discussions outside of this webinar. So we've gone on a bit longer than I thought, but I think it's been great. Thank you for your time. A couple of people saying thank you for your attendance. As always with my webinars, we've gone quite a bit over, but it's been great. Good luck, and quite happy to chat, as I say, one-to-one with anybody. Have a good rest of the day, rest of the evening, wherever you are in the world, and hopefully I'll see you again on another webinar. All the best and see you soon. Bye-bye.